Hello, everyone. This is the review or the overview for Chapter 3. So let's take a look, get started. First, let's think about what culture is. And many of you probably, excuse me, have heard the term culture before. Perhaps you have an idea of what that means for yourself when we talk particularly about, ethnic culture, Black culture, or Mexican culture, Asian culture, Chinese culture, etc. So we probably have our own personal understanding of culture, but it's important to understand that for sociologists, culture is much more broad than just an individual idea of one's own culture. Culture is the way an entire group of people live. It's the way of life. It's our ideas and our values. It's our food. It's our religion. It is the traditions that we pass on, things like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, all of those things that are part of our everyday life. And in fact, you could even think of culture as being like a blueprint for living. A blueprint, if you don't know what that is, a blueprint is a design that's drawn in blue ink, typically by architects, and it's a design for a building. And so to say that culture is a blueprint for living within a particular society, we're really saying that culture is essentially a design or a map for how to navigate, how to live within a particular society. And, we may not necessarily see parts of our own culture just because they are so very well known to us, things that we've been doing our whole lives, and may not stand out as such. But to someone who is not part of that culture, a particular thing might stand out to those individuals way more than to ourselves. And of course, because we are such a diverse society, there has been over the last, say, 40, 50 years, much more of an emphasis on recognizing that there are very unique cultures, plural, cultures within the United States because there are so many different groups living in the United States. So, as I said, culture is very broad, it's all encompassing. Culture can even include standards of beauty, styles of dress, the food, the music, even the way that we speak. For example, in the United States, English is the, official language, I guess you could call it. But in different parts of the United States, you may hear more of other languages than solely just English. And even when you only hear English, people may be speaking it with different accents than you're used to. So culture's learned. It's something that we learn through our interactions with people around us, particularly family and friends, but also schools help to teach culture. So does the media, and to some extent, so does religion. Ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism occurs, and this is important to really think about and consider. Ethnocentrism happens when people use their own culture, their own backgrounds, their own perspectives as the standard, as the norm, by which they evaluate other groups or individuals. And there's this tendency to view one's own culture, one's own way of doing things as the norm, and anything that is outside of that is viewed typically as abnormal or strange or weird, etc. And unfortunately, we all do this. It's something that I think we learn from others, particularly early in life. We learn to dislike, say, certain kinds of foods. Why? Not because we've tried them. Oftentimes, it's because they just look weird. They smell weird. And so we just think, well, yuck, I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to try that. When in fact, it might be quite delicious. Many of us will not try certain foods simply because of how they look. And now I know that sounds silly, to judge a food simply by how it looks. But if that sounds silly, then consider how often we also judge people based upon how they look, how they speak, how they dress. Um, yeah, we do it. And most of the time we aren't even aware that we are doing that. So we all know ethnocentrism pretty well, I think. We can all think of a time when we've done that. But I want us to think more carefully here about cultural relativism. Cultural relativism it takes much more effort, number one, and it means that we have to slow down. It means we have to slow our thinking down and our process of discernment. And what we're trying to do with cultural relativism is we're trying to understand another culture or another group of people based on their terms, from their perspective, rather than judging them according to our own standards or our own culture. And so for sociologists, of course, it's very important for us to make certain that we are using cultural relativism and not our own, perhaps biased standards, because if we truly want to understand others, we have to be willing to step outside of our perspective, our comfort zone, our own standards, and try to understand the standards or the ways of doing things of others. Having said that, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we always have to agree with parts of other people's culture that we find perhaps reprehensible. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we're trying to understand other cultures based on their standards, not our own. However, there are times, of course, when we might need to judge another behavior, not by the standards of that group, but by our own standards. And so I'll give you a few examples here. Genocide. Genocide is a type of ethnocentrism. Genocide occurs because one group of people decides that they don't like another group of people. And so their decision is, well, we're just going to get rid of those people. We're just going to kill them off. Now, of course, we know that this happened in Nazi Germany and in any place that the Nazis were able to take over in Europe. And people targeted were not just Jews, although they were the largest of the groups targeted, but also people who were gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, people who were mentally ill, people who were physically disabled, people, at times even Catholics. And so anybody who wasn't a Protestant, who wasn't white, was typically a target for the Nazis. Now, of course, it's easier to hide your religion, for example, Catholicism, than it is to hide your, quote, Jewishness. And so, unfortunately, although it was possible for people to pass at times, but if your neighbors knew before the Nazis took over that you were Jewish and they reported you, well, then there wasn't any going back from that. But I want you to consider how genocide is something that I think as a human community, we have to stand up and say, hey, that can't happen. I believe that what is occurring in China with the Uyghur community in the northern part of China is a really good example of a type of genocide and or we might call ethnic cleansing, because the Chinese government is trying to impose the Chinese culture on these Uyghurs. They're an ethnic group in the northern part of China, and they are primarily Muslim. And so they do have a different culture from the Chinese, and of course the Chinese government does not encourage religion at all. And so I think that is a type of at least ethnic cleansing by trying to impose the Chinese culture on this group of people. But also we know that there have been reports by Human Rights International and Amnesty International that some people have been killed because they refuse to take on these characteristics. But of course, Another example is female genital mutilation. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It is also known as female circumcision, so you might find it under that term as well, female circumcision. It involves removing either fully or partially the clitoris, and depending upon the type of female circumcision being performed, it may also involve removal of some of the labia, either the inner, the outer labia, or sometimes both. And of course, this is typically done on young girls without their knowledge that it's going to happen. And certainly without their consent, because these girls can't know what going through this process is going to mean for them down the road. You have to be old enough to understand in order to give consent. So are honor killings, honor maimings. Those are things in which in some countries, if the woman, whether it's the sister or the wife or the mother or an aunt, a female relative, disobeys and dishonors the family, then it's okay, according to the culture in these countries, for the woman to be punished. And if you just want to punish her, you would maim her, maybe cut off her nose or an ear to disfigure her, or maybe even throw some acid in her face to make her, disfigured and unattractive, or even worse, maybe to kill her. So these are things that I don't think we should use cultural relativism to just say, well, hey, that's their culture, that's what they do in these countries, etc. No, I think we have to take a stand as a human community in those instances. But generally, if we're trying to just understand why these people in this group perhaps eat beef and these people don't, because they consider the cow a sacred animal. I'm talking here about Hindus, and yet in westernized countries, the cow is, very tasty and makes great burgers and ribs and steaks, etc. There is where I think you can use cultural relativism to try to understand why they have these different understandings of the animal and how they either revere it and consider it sacred, or they view it as a food source. All right, so let's take a look at the components of culture. There's material culture, and you see a couple of pictures here of material culture. Material culture is simply everything that humans create, make, and use. So you see all these lovely buildings here. You see the game of soccer. It includes everything that is tangible, right? Everything that humans create, make, and use. Our clothing, our buildings, our cars, our artwork, all the stuff that we have created, we make, and we use, technology, etc. However, symbolic culture is much more, it's much more intangible. That is, we can't see and touch these things necessarily, but we can recognize that they exist. So things like beliefs, okay? And one of the most well-known types of beliefs throughout the world is religion, right? And religion really is about belief. You either believe or you don't. And of course, there are so many different belief systems out there, from Hinduism and Taoism and Taoism to, of course, Christianity and the various branches of Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism and Episcopalianism and Baptists, etc., Catholics, all these different groups within the Christian umbrella. And then, of course, there are there's Islam and Judaism, and I'm sure there's plenty more that I'm not even mentioning right now, Buddhism, etc. And so that's a kind of belief. People either believe or they don't. There's no way of really proving these things. People either believe or they don't. Now we may say, oh well, but there's the Bible as proof, or there's the Quran as proof for Islam. But the reality is this: those are documents that, for the most part, were created after many of the events many of the events that are depicted in these documents occurred, which means then that people wrote these things down later after they'd been told them. Most of these are not firsthand accounts. And so it really means then that we're just believing what somebody else said and then somebody else wrote down. There's no place where we can go and, have a one-on-one conversation with whatever higher power we believe in. And so beliefs are a huge part of symbolic culture in the United States, but so are values. These are things that we believe to be important. And assumptions that we make are part of our symbolic culture, but so are our ways of behaving, our norms, the way we interact, the kinds of communication we have. That's part of symbolic culture too. And we use signs, we use gestures, we use language, we even use facial expressions as part of our symbolic culture. That's part of how we interact with others. So the signs, think of traffic signals or a logo, the Nike logo or the Under Armour logo or, the Coca-Cola logo or anything. Most of us could look at something and go, oh, yeah, that's, the Monster logo, or that's the McDonald's logo, or, whatever. These are things that mean something to us. Why? Because we learned the meaning of that logo. We learn the meaning of that sign or that symbol. The flag of the United States is a very well-known symbol throughout the world. Now, not everybody sees the same thing when they see the flag. Some people, when they see the flag, see things like freedom and rights and equality and, a number of things. All of them positive. However, we also have to recognize that other people, when they see that same symbol, the flag of the U.S., they may see some very negative things. They may see things that the others might not agree with. But it doesn't really matter because it's in the eye of the beholder. It's how you interpret that thing. It's the same thing with art. Someone might really like the work of a particular artist, and you think, well, it doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't mean that you're right and the other person's wrong or vice versa. It just means that these are your interpretation of that symbol or that art or whatever it is that you're viewing that you have a disagreement about. And gestures, of course, as I said, we use our body language, we use hand gestures and facial expressions, even a smile. You think about a smile, and even a smile has different meanings. Not all smiles are the same. Some smiles are fake smiles. Some smiles are much more genuine. Some smiles might be sarcastic smiles. The smile my mother used to give us when we were in the store and had asked too many times for something was that, Mexican mother smile that's pissed off, which essentially means, okay, when we get home, you're going to get your ass beat. So smiles are not all the same either, and we learn to tell the difference. And of course, language. Language is a big part of culture because it is the primary way by which we communicate. And we do it both in written form, we do it verbally as well, but we also have different social media that we use, and there are different ways in which we might communicate on those various platforms as well. All right, so I want to get to values and norms and how values and norms are shared. Norms are essentially rules that tell us how to behave in a particular situation, particular social environment. They tell us how to act, what to say, how to dress, how to express ourselves, etc. And so those norms help us to live within a society and be relatively well accepted. Right? They help us to be able to go to school and then from there go out go to college, maybe get a job, maybe meet a partner, maybe have a family or not. But in order to live life fully, we need to know what the norms are in a particular culture. Now, having said that, it doesn't necessarily mean that we embrace every single part of the norms of a particular culture, but by and large, most people adopt enough of these norms that we see the because we see the value in accepting them and embracing them. Values, on the other hand, are shared beliefs about what a group considers to be worthwhile or desirable. So essentially, here's what happens. Values guide the norms. Values help to guide the creation of norms. So let's take this. Let's say education. Let's say that our value is education, and indeed we say that that's important to us as a society. Education is our value. So then what do? Well, what we do is we create norms that reflect what we say our value is. So if our value is education, then what do? We say, well, it has to be compulsory. I mean, it is compulsory. In every state in the United States, education is compulsory, meaning you have to go to school. Why? Because we say that education is good for kids. So one norm is it's compulsory. A second norm is that it must be free. Every state must provide a public school educational system from kindergarten through 12th grade. Okay, so think about how important those two norms are. We believe that education is so important for children that not only do we make it compulsory, we force them to go even if they don't want to go, we also make certain that it is publicly funded so that no matter what your social class is, you get education. You get educated in the United States. So here's another example. Second example, last one. Our value, we say, is justice, right? In fact, isn't that in our Pledge of Allegiance? One nation with justice, with liberty and justice for all. So justice, we say justice is important to us. So what do? Well, our Constitution, we have amendments 1 through 10, known as the Bill of Rights, that reflect the idea that we believe justice is important. Okay, so again, values come first, and then the norms are created to reflect what we have said is important. I could go on and on and on with these, but I won't. I just give you those two examples, so hopefully you understand how they are related. All right. Norms can be formal, they can be informal. In fact, here, there are 3 different types of norms here. A folkway. Folkway is just a loosely enforced norm. It's common practices and customs, things that we do most of the time without even thinking about it. For example, when we greet someone, we say hello or hi, or we give them a nod. That's a folkway. If somebody says hello, the expectation is you're going to say hello back, or in some way respond in kind. Now, not everybody does, and so, but nothing terrible is going to happen. I mean, assuming that, none of us are violent people, and if you say hello to somebody and the other person says, fuck you, then, we might take offense, but we probably, and maybe never say hello again to that person, but we probably, nothing bad is going to happen to that person. It's not like lightning is going to come and strike the person down, or we can't call the police and ask that they be arrested because they didn't say hello back to us. So hi, please, thank you, sharing if we're eating something and the other person doesn't have anything, especially if it's, a friend or a coworker. If you're on a bus, maybe not so much, or the subway, maybe not so much. But, just simple common practices are folkways. A mores. A mores is a norm that is of moral significance. That is, it is stronger, it's a stronger norm, and it's morally important. It typically involves the kinds of things we typically think of as morality, right? Things that say, not stealing, not murdering, not committing adultery. Those are things that are mores. And of course, um, a more can also be something that, because we think it is so bad, many societies have created a law prohibiting that behavior. So, murder, for example, theft, those are things that were once just mores, but almost every society has created laws against that, prohibiting that behavior. And then a taboo. A taboo is something that we not, it's not something that we necessarily even teach children, but as children, we learn, given our interactions within social environments, that there are certain things that are just so disgusting, and we're repelled by these ideas that we don't even think about violating them. One, for example, is having a relationship with a brother or a sister. That's taboo, right? It's just something that's so repulsive to most of us that we would never even look at a brother or sister in that way. And it's not that our parents sat us down and told us, hey, you know what, heads up, this is really, really bad shit, don't do it. Don't ever look at each other with any kind of ideas of having some sort of sexual relationship. I don't remember my parents ever doing that. You probably don't either. They didn't have to, because we got the message through all of our other interactions that, hey, this is just some really, really bad shit. Pedophilia is another kind of taboo, but it also, of course, is against the law. So there you go. All right, now what do we do when people don't abide by the norms? How do we enforce them? Well, sometimes we have very low levels of sanctions. We can sanction somebody either in a positive or a negative way. And if it's a fairly low level violation of a folkway, for example, if we're eating dinner at someone's home and somebody farts while people are eating, then, hey, that's pretty nasty, right? And so people will probably have a very negative reaction. Maybe they just get up from the table because they lost their appetite and they don't, interact with that person the rest of the evening. But that would be a sanction that's possible. Or what if at work, you have a coworker that, always burps or belches quite loudly after having eaten lunch, and the person's cubicle is right next to yours. You may have very negative reaction to that. Maybe even go complain to HR that, hey, this is just too much for me. On the other hand, sometimes we sanction people in a positive way. We want to reinforce that behavior. And so think about it this way. Parents trying to potty train a child, they will give lots of positive sanctions, especially when the kid actually takes a dump, say, in the little potty trainer thing. They get so happy, yay, clap hands, and yay, look, call the other parent over, look, see, oh, wow, this is a great thing, clapping hands, yay. Maybe the kid even gets a cookie or, some sort of little reward. And so what the parents are trying to do is to teach the child, hey, this is a really good thing you did, and do it again. And eventually, we all got potty trained in that manner. Of course, if it's a much more serious violation of a norm, such that that norm became one in which a law was created regarding it, then we may, of course, engage in social control of that person, either through prosecuting that person in the criminal justice system so that the person either serves time in jail or in prison, or sending that person through the probation system so that that person maybe gets community service or has to go to classes, etc. That there are more stringent ways of dealing with much more high-level violations of norms. But we do have ways of trying to enforce the norms. All right, so dominant culture. Dominant culture is what we typically think of, when I say we, sociologists typically think of when we're thinking of culture. We're thinking of the dominant culture of the group that has the power and the most wealth, prestige, status, influence. Not necessarily the most numbers, but the most power. And in the United States, those are whites. And of course, we sociologists talk about subcultures These are groups within that same society that are different in some way. They might be different in terms of their values, their norms, their lifestyle, but they're different in some way. And it can be a very small way, so that it's almost barely noticeable. It can be something that is midway, different, or it can be something that is very, very different. And so counterculture is a group of people who often will openly reject and maybe even actively oppose the norms and values of society. So the hippies, I think, of the 1960s could be called a counterculture group. I don't really consider BLM or other groups that work towards social justice to be counterculture groups. I consider them more to be subcultures that are variant, meaning that they have slight differences with the mainstream. But I don't really consider them counterculture. I don't think we really see counterculture groups that often in most societies. All right, so that is it for this